To the newspaper. I write articles for the County News, which is a black-owned newspaper. And so what I'm going to do is read part one, and I'll just give a few comments about part two, so that you'll have some kind of understanding of the history of Juneteenth. June 19th, 1865 was the day of emancipation for approximately 183,000 enslaved Africans in Texas, the last bastion of chattel slavery in the Confederate States of America. However, the story of Juneteenth is not complete without understanding that over 227,000 Africans remained enslaved in the United States of America, in Kentucky and Delaware, two of the 5 states which Abraham Lincoln had exempted from the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln exempted Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and the West Virginia Territory from his proclamation because he considered their loyalty to the Union to be more important than emancipating Africans in those slave states.
Wow.
Since the proclamation did not apply, the enslaved populations of Kentucky and Delaware were not emancipated until the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified in December 1865. So what I'm saying is this: we celebrate Juneteenth. We call it the end of chattel slavery. That's true in a sense because it was the end of chattel slavery in the Confederate States of America. It was not the end of slavery in the United States of America. We have to make that distinction because in recent years people are bringing this criticism up, say, why y'all celebrating when African people were still enslaved in parts of this country? But the fact of the matter is this: on June 19, 1866, the people who had been emancipated in Texas gathered on Galveston Island to celebrate Juneteenth, which was also known as Emancipation Day, Liberation Day, and Jubilation Day in its early years. That gathering became the event that we celebrate today. So when they gathered on June 19, 1866, all Africans had in fact been emancipated from chattel slavery. The historical context that we are celebrating becomes critically important. For those of us who are focused on the liberation and empowerment of African people, Juneteenth is more about the agency of African people to liberate themselves than it is about the machinations of empire politicians like Abraham Lincoln and others. Juneteenth is the celebration of the historic struggle of African people to make chattel slavery the paramount issue in 19th century America in order to resolve it. Thus, Juneteenth is first and foremost a celebration of African resistance to chattel slavery. I can't emphasize this point more than I need to emphasize it more than just saying that. If Africans had not continued to struggle to make chattel slavery the paramount issue in this country, it never would have been resolved. Our esteemed ancestor, Dr. Amos Wilson, taught us, all commemorations must lead to transformation of our consciousness and the power relations on this planet. False definitions and narratives hinder this process. We must become more original and creative in defining who we are, what we have done and can do. Juneteenth must be viewed as part of the continuing African struggle for liberation and empowerment. We can't just put a stake in the ground and say, oh, this is freedom. Well, first of all, you have to define freedom. Our ancestors defined what freedom was, but we have to see it as a continuing struggle because of what happened in this country, what has happened in this country since June 19, 1865 and 1866. In the context of struggle, when we celebrate Juneteenth, we absorb the spirit of our ancestors who struggled against chattel slavery. When we celebrate Juneteenth, we absorb the spirit of Mum Beck, Elizabeth Freeman, the first enslaved African to file and win freedom via a lawsuit in Massachusetts in 1781. We absorb the spirit of the 1739 Stono Rebellion in South Carolina. We absorb the spirit of the Prosser brothers, Gabriel, Solomon, and Martin, who planned a revolt in Virginia in 1800. We absorb the spirit of Charles Deslandes in the 1811 German coast uprising in Louisiana. We absorb the spirit of Denmark Vesey, Gullah Jack Pritchard, and all of the Africans in the planned 1822 rebellion in Charleston, South Carolina. We absorb the spirit of David Walker in his 1829 appeal to the colored citizens of the world. We absorbed the spirit of Freedom's Journal and the over 40 black-owned newspapers in the 19th century, which derided slavery via their editorials. We absorbed the spirit of Nat Turner in his 1831 rebellion. We absorbed the spirit of Maria Stewart and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and their spoken and written words against slavery. We absorbed the spirit of William Steele, John Parker, and the Underground Railroad. We absorbed the spirit of Harriet Tubman, her numerous trips to free the enslaved Africans, and of course her successful 1863 Combahee River raid, a military raid which she planned in South Carolina that liberated over 700 enslaved Africans. We absorbed the spirit of the Gullah people who fled to Florida and fought the United States Army alongside indigenous people in 3 wars between 1816 and 1858. We absorbed the spirit of countless others, known and unknown, who continued to escape from chattel slavery, forcing the United States government to enact 3 separate laws to capture and return enslaved Africans who liberated themselves. We have the Fugitive Slave Clause in the United States Constitution. Most people know about the 3/5 clause, but there were actually 3 clauses that referred to African people, and one of them was the Fugitive Slave Clause. We also had the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793 and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and they want to tell us that our people were docile and humble and not trying to free themselves. Well, if that was the case, why did you have to enact 3 separate laws, each one of them more draconian than the other? We absorbed the spirit of Dred and Harriet Scott, whose legal challenges for their freedom resulted in the 1857 Dred Scott decision, an event which led to the Civil War. Of course, we absorbed the spirit of Frederick Douglass and his leadership. We absorbed the spirit of Henry Highland and Julia Garnett and Martin R. and Kate Delaney and the National Negro Convention movement pushed forward against chattel slavery. We absorbed the spirit of Dangerfield Newby, Shields Green, Lewis Leary, John Copeland, Osborne Anderson, who joined John Brown and his sons in their assault on Harper's Ferry in 1859. And of course, we absorbed the spirit of the 200,000 black men who fought to end chattel slavery during the Civil War. I have to emphasize this history because too much of our history has been focused on what other people have done. When we first started dealing with Juneteenth, almost all the focus was on the Emancipation Proclamation and the arrival of United States soldiers in Galveston. We never dealt with all of the activities of our people that made that possible, that forced Lincoln to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. The primary duty of every American president is to preserve and expand the power and prosperity of the United States. Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 election with about 40% of the popular vote, but not one vote from the South, not one. He didn't get one electoral vote in the electoral college, and these people didn't regard him as their president. Well, we see a lot of that today when people say, that guy's not our president, this guy's not our president. This is history repeating itself, and the results will likely be the same, a civil conflict. The challenges facing Lincoln were far greater than any of his predecessors. Chattel slavery had become the predominant issue in this country thanks to our people. Based on their perception of Lincoln as anti-slavery, 7 southern states led by South Carolina seceded from the United States and eventually formed the Confederate States of America. Now, Lincoln would extend several olive leaves to these people. One of them, I'm not going to go through all of this, but one of the things that Lincoln agreed to do was he agreed to compensate the slave owners for freeing enslaved Africans. In other words, reparations for the slave owners. And when slavery was outlawed in Washington, D.C. in 1862, they paid every slave owner $300 for each enslaved African that they released. Reparations for the slave owners, none for those whose labor had been stolen for 246 years. Of course, when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he extended another olive leaf to the rebels in the South. He proposed 3 constitutional amendments. One was for compensated emancipation. 2, he said that he was willing to allow chattel slavery to last where it existed until 1900. Did you understand what I said? Lincoln was willing to allow chattel slavery to last until 1900, meaning my great-grandmother, Mary Monster Vaughn, and my grandmother, Eva Freeman Bradley, would have both been born in slavery had it lasted until 1900. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit.
That's sad.
Because I don't want to take too much of your time here. But the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on January 1st, 1863. Enslaved Africans continued to free themselves by tens of thousands, moving into contraband camps, which provided the first taste of freedom from chattel slavery. So basically what would happen is, as a Union general like Sherman or David Hunter or somebody would capture land or would run the Confederates off of land, Africans would leave the plantations and go into these camps to live and to begin to farm and do things to liberate themselves, to enjoy their first taste of freedom. During the period of the Civil War, when there were declining numbers of white volunteers, over 200,000 black men, 90,000 of whom had been enslaved, joined the United States Army and Navy and helped turn the tide of the war to victory for the United States. The National Archives reports that black carpenters, chaplains, cooks, guards, laborers, nurses, scouts, spies, steamboat pilots, surgeons, and teamsters also contributed to the war cause. Black women who could not formally join the Army nevertheless served as nurses, spies, and scouts, the most famous, of course, being Harriet Tubman. In order to plan the raid, Harriet Tubman had to dress up and act like a slave and walk among the Confederates doing reconnaissance, and then she came back and planned the raid, which led to the liberation.
That's sad.
So this is the agency of African people that we are talking about when we say that we are celebrating Juneteenth. Now, I want to say this one thing in closing, and that's this. If our ancestors in 1865 or 1866 had been able to look ahead 11 years and see the compromise of 1877, they may have begun to plan for what was coming. They may have been able to plan for what was coming, but they had no way of knowing. We have a way of knowing. We see what's happening in this country. For us not to start right now planning for what's coming would be to repeat their mistakes. And I say that to also say that in this climate, as we gather, wherever we gather on Juneteenth weekend, we need to be on the highest alert, because a lot of these people are going absolutely berserk because their fear of becoming a minority in this country, and their fear of genetic annihilation. They're going berserk, and we become their soft targets. So we need to be on guard. We're not going to stop celebrating, but we need to be prepared just in case something happens. And that's the words I want to leave you with. Thank you.
That's right.